It was my Chinese martial arts training that gave me not only the skill of teaching and cultivating my inner voice, but also the initial reconnection with my body, mind, and spirit. I trained in a traditional lineage-based Kung Fu, or Gong Fu, the correct pronunciation, and it was this authentic teaching that gave me the foundation of what a truly transformative and embodied spiritual education looks like. Ironically, it took being rooted in a foreign cultural tradition to come back home to my own Dharmic way of life. When I first started my training, I immediately leaned into books. I wanted to know everything about the culture and context behind Kung Fu practice, which is very strange because I can't understand where this lack of curiosity from non-natives comes from when it comes to yoga, most of whom refuse to learn or respect the history and culture of this tradition, and in fact go out of their way to abuse the knowledge they receive. For example, abusing statues of our deities, treating them like decor and using them for aesthetic purposes in their studios and even branding. This disrespect is not accidental. It is taught. It is the conditioning of colonialism and supremacist cultures. Yoga is a sacred path deeply rooted in Hindu Dharma and has been preserved and transmitted for millennia through Hindu traditions, scriptures, and spiritual lineages. In the same way, traditional Chinese martial arts, including Kung Fu, have been preserved and passed down through dedicated lineage-based systems, where the transmission of knowledge from master to disciple is deeply rooted in ancestral wisdom, philosophical teachings, and spiritual discipline. You know, back in my martial arts days, I often heard discussions about certain schools of Chinese martial arts being guarded when it came to allowing outsiders into their communities and classes. And now, if there was even a grain of truth to that, I completely understand why. In the Indian tradition, while yoga can be practiced by anyone, the entirety of its knowledge is not meant for everyone. Some wisdom is only imparted when a student is truly ready to receive it. There exists criteria for eligibility in yoga. Yet, the colonized mind, rather the colonized monster, seeks to consume everything without discernment. It never stops. It takes because it feels entitled to, because that is the inherent nature of the colonial mindset and ego. But humility is a foundation of dharmic knowledge. And in all honesty, I have yet to encounter humility in those who position themselves as authorities on a culture and tradition that is not theirs. Now, I'm not saying people can't engage with cultures beyond their own. I'm saying that humility and respect are prerequisites, not just for practicing, but especially for teaching someone else's sacred tradition. The Kung Fu masters understood this well. My training was rigorous and deeply disciplined. For years, I was the only girl in my class. I was punched in the gut by my teacher just as much as the next guy. I was only allowed to learn words and numbers in Cantonese because you had to know the Cantonese. Meanwhile, Dharmic traditions have been far too accommodating. We allow cultural appropriators to butcher Sanskrit, and some Indian sycophants even praise them for mispronouncing Vedic hymns and even singing them, completely oblivious to how wrong and harmful this is. This knowledge has been meticulously preserved through oral tradition, passed down with precision through lineage, and yet neo-colonial egos continue to think they have a free pass to distort and corrupt Sanskrit and Vedic teachings. It's a disgrace, and instead of calling it out, some colonized so-called, quote, South Asians actually celebrate it, completely unaware of the harm and erasure being perpetuated on a global scale. And yet, white folks still continue to turn to other white folks for learning Vedic knowledge, further erasing Indian and Dharmic bodies from spaces where Dharmic and Vedic teachings should be centered. This kind of butchering wouldn't be allowed in, for example, Chinese martial arts. Though I haven't paid close enough attention to attempts at the colonization of that tradition, my focus in recent years have been on decolonizing my own mind, body, and cultural history. Since 2020, I stopped practicing martial arts. In the years leading up to the pandemic, I transitioned to fitness-oriented boxing and Muay Thai. I also enrolled in other martial arts whenever short courses were available, primarily to maintain mental agility, clarity, and fitness during a continuous period of healing and transformation. In 2019, I began training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, first through personal sessions and then through an academy, but I eventually stopped completely due to major life changes. I really missed the training, but this pause put me on a new path, one of decolonizing yoga and confronting the places within me where colonial, predatory energy still lingers. Because, in truth, we are all harboring this predator within. It is the narcissist, it is the colonizer inhabiting the inner landscape. For more on this, check out Season 1, Episode 3 of my podcast. It's titled Narcissism and Colonialism, the Same Demon. Anyway, from 2020 onwards, I was on a very deep inner quest where I had to empty myself of this inner predator. Detox might be a good word. I had to unlearn in order to relearn my own cultural history and the practice of yoga under indigenous stewardship. And let me tell you, since the colonial claws are so deeply embedded in Hindu ancestral lineages, this is a journey of a lifetime, if not lifetimes. And so yes, even for me, I hold tightly to the level of humility and sacredness that comes from nurturing and embodying the wisdom and practices of the land of my ancestors. It is no simple task. So when you see others so easily appropriate and abuse your cultural traditions, you can't imagine the hurt we have to live with, on top of being discriminated against and excluded from holding any authority in yoga spaces as an Indian body. Don't get me wrong, some Indians do make it, but usually what I see is a compromise to their Indianness. You have to mimic white body supremacy and erase your Hinduness or Indian appearance to get close to those who hold the power in hiring, for example, yoga teachers, let alone be paid equally for it. You have to have a certain level of proximity to whiteness. You have to shed your Hindu identity and strip yoga of its roots and culture to be seen or heard. Pretty fucking disgusting. Anyway, I understand the need to fit in, the very real need to survive, but I'm not going to be that person. I'm going to protect my culture from the harm of continued colonialism, not obey the colonial master. I think my ancestors did enough of that. My loyalty is to Dharma, and what I've found is that Dharma alone sustains me. Recently, I started reflecting on why I was so drawn to martial arts as a child, specifically Kung Fu. When I practiced it, no matter how many books I read on its philosophy and culture, I couldn't connect to it as deeply as I now connect with my own indigenous roots. And of course, it's simple now. Let me compare it to my experience with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. My last experience in BJJ wasn't great. The men seemed to be triggered by my energy. I come across as very feminine with a deeply vulnerable nature, and this triggered the hypermasculinity that's often present in BJJ. These men were wearing masks, so what they saw in me was their own unintegrated shadow. Naturally, there was some bullying, but with age, I've learned how to handle men with fragile egos, and I did. After the pandemic, I didn't want to be around such toxic, misogynistic energy. Here's a difference I see between a practice that's essentially colonized. BJJ, for example, has been colonized by white men, is hyper-masculine and lacks respect for women who embody a feminine nature. And I know there are women who may not share my experience, but I rarely encountered soft-natured women like myself in these spaces. Now, Kung Fu is a completely different ballgame. I've never encountered discrimination in Chinese martial arts over the years. In my own classes, there was humility and deep respect. No egos. The tradition is upheld by lineage and is protected from ignorance. Students with egos or a lack of respect for gender, even gender fluidity, would be kicked out. Being the only girl in the class, I never felt out of place. The atmosphere and environment upheld by lineage is inherently different. It is protected from stupidity. The same stupidity that outsiders of the culture frame as, quote, gatekeeping because they're complaining about not having access, only so they can corrupt and distort it with their despicable behaviors. Just like in yoga, in Kung Fu, you have to meet the criteria of being a good student in order to advance your training, and in some cases, even to begin. There are certain qualities and attributes you must have in order to make good of the practice. In yoga, we call this an adhikari, someone who holds the qualities necessary to receive and practice the teachings. Not everyone is fit to receive yogic or Vedic teachings. Just because they exist doesn't mean they are for you, nor should you just take or consume them. You need a lineage teacher to give you the transformative knowledge bit by bit, and only that which is appropriate for your body and level of understanding at that time. It's like going into a Kung Fu class and expecting to learn weapons from day one. No, this takes years of first cultivating a strong foundation, and the weapon you learn is what the teacher gives you, not what you want. Sorry, but this is a traditional knowing. Learn to check the ego, and better yet, work on decolonizing, because this wanting to grab hold of something just because your ego desires it is not the quality of an eligible student. Not in authentic martial arts, not in authentic yoga. If it is for you, it will come to you. You wouldn't know this if you're coming with the predator energy. You'd only have access to true knowledge through a humble, open, and curious mind. This is universal law, not mine. Anyway, astrologically, among other reasons, I have a Sun and Mars conjunction, which is where my martial arts passion comes from. Interestingly, the Kung Fu style I practice was known as hard and external, and it proved to be the methodology that provided a container for my overflowing feminine intensity. It's pretty ironic that I have a tendency towards the hard or external forms of Kung Fu rather than the soft forms. The point I'm making is that traditional Chinese martial arts training eventually brought me home to my own roots. Interestingly, Kung Fu shares the same Dharmic roots. It was brought into China by an Indian monk, Dharma. No wonder it called to me. I love the similarities between the Tao and Brahman, the concept of the eternal, formless reality in Sanatan Dharma, which governs all existence. While the Tao is the natural flow of the universe beyond human comprehension, Brahman is the ultimate, unchanging essence that pervades everything. Similarly, the concept of Rita in Vedic thought represents the cosmic order, the principle of truth and harmony that sustains the universe, but with an emphasis on moral and ethical alignment. In both traditions, there is a deep reverence for the unifying force that underlies all things, offering a path towards spiritual cultivation and harmony. And similarly, you have the concept of chi and prana, vital life force energy. Unlike colonized martial arts, Kung Fu can be considered very dharmic. It's about self-mastery. It's not for defeating the enemy outside or for an outward show. It is spiritual cultivation. It's about conquering oneself. And here's what's important. Kung Fu practice and discipline through the years enabled me to become an adhikari in yoga and Vedic knowledge, a person who holds the characteristics and qualities to practice and teach yoga, someone who honors lineage and upholds the teachings with deep humility and respect. Thank you to my martial arts teachers and my main Kung Fu teacher. I'm ever grateful and in debt for the training and teachings received, which gave me a training for life and offered me the ability to meet life with courage and a warrior spirit. Ultimately, it led me back home to Dharma, awakening me to the path of yoga in this lifetime. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.